So you had these financial elites who were like, okay, this is getting out of hand. We might have to do something about this, in the sense that you have these financial crises creeping up, like unemployment, and it was a stagflation crisis. Was stagflation in the sense that capitalist growth is slowing down, while at the same time inflation is getting out of control as well. So they had to do something about it. And Harvey dates the quote unquote neoliberal turn to this Powell memo, and it comes from Lewis Powell, who was, let's see, I'm going to go back and actually just find who he actually was.
He was at the time. He was some sort of high-ranking judge, but he eventually did become a Supreme Court justice.
Right, under Nixon.
Yeah, Nixon, who was the last president who sort of saw what was coming. He was the guy who kind of knew towards the end, right, that there was something happening.
What do you mean by that?
Just that he could see
the gold standard stuff, and
right, that he could see that the wheels were starting to come off.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I also read the Powell memo on the Wikipedia article for it. It says that it was explicitly written in reaction to Ralph Nader's book and like the consumer movement of the late '60s. So like Ralph Nader wrote that book about seatbelts, right, and the automobile industry that sort of turned a lot of people on to how evil American corporations could be, just giving no fucks about human life or well-being, letting them hurtle around the interstate highway system in these like tin boxes, essentially, with no protection whatsoever. And so Ralph Nader writes this book, and this memo is written partly in reaction to that, as sort of this way of like reestablishing faith in the free market and like corporate dominance, right? In reaction to like the consumer movement. Not that like the American like consumer rights or like consumer movement was a huge threat to capitalist domination necessarily, because it's really rooted in people like making individual consumption choices. But so Lewis Powell writes this memo to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in August of 1971. I'll just read a little bit from Harvey here. It said it argued that criticism of and opposition to the U.S. free enterprise system had gone too far, and that, quote, the time had come, indeed it is long overdue, for the wisdom, ingenuity, and resources of American business to be marshaled against those who would destroy it. Okay, and then so he like also lays out a bunch of things that the Chamber of Commerce should do as well.
I want to add real quick, and I'm like ashamed to have learned this way later in my life than I should have, but the Chamber of Commerce is not a government institution. It sounds like a government institution, but it's just like a federation of capitalists, like a non-government, like they just decide to come together and kind of, it's almost like a union for capitalists in a way.
Yeah. So it's this organization that a bunch of businesses can join to exert their collective power over the populace. Okay, so let's see. Moving on from the Powell memo, let's see what's we see this neoliberal turn where dominance of the business elite, of the financial elite. He wants to sort of reestablish dominance and really put the boot on the neck of labor, suppress workers' rights, suppress any sort of leftward momentum. And so you have Harvey talks about like at least an ideological foundation to the neoliberal turn and to the choices that financial elites and political elites made during the neoliberal turn as ruling class power was reasserted and reestablished after the Powell memo into the Reagan administration, and in the UK into the Thatcher administration. So the neoliberal sort of ideological roots come from the Mont Pelerin Society, which was this secret society not secret, I don't know, just a small, right, collection of sort of intellectuals and I guess rich guys,
economists,
right?
Which side note,
economists.
Mont Pelerin Society, does that not sound like some Epstein shit?
It does.
Parody, but it does.
Yeah, it does. Sorry, well, that was just a tick. I said like secret society. Come on, it's literally called a society. Who calls their club a society?
Yeah, it's Bohemian Grove, right? It sounds like the Bohemian Grove.
Yeah, it was also like formed in like the Swiss Alps or something, which just adds like I'm imagining like the Bat Cave in the side of a mountain.
This is Bond villain territory.
Yeah.
So the ideology comes from the Mont Pelerin Society. This is in all the way back in the 1940s. Do we want to say anything about what those guys actually believed?
So I have their founding statement in front of me
Okay.
right now.
Go ahead.
All right, let's see if I have the ability to read. Real quick, in the same vein as the Powell memo, they really like think like the world's gonna end if they don't have their way. So let me get started. The central values of civilization are in danger. Over large stretches of the Earth's surface, the essential conditions of human dignity and freedom have already disappeared. In others, they are under constant menace from the development of current tendencies of policy. The position of the individual and the voluntary group are progressively undermined by extensions of arbitrary power. Even that most precious possession of Western man, freedom of thought and expression, is threatened by the spread of creeds which, claiming the privilege of tolerance when in the position of a minority, seek only to establish a position of power in which they can suppress and obliterate all views but their own. The group holds that these developments have been fostered by the growth of a view of history which denies all absolute moral standards and by the growth of theories which question the desirability of the rule of law. It holds further that they have been fostered by a decline of belief in private property and the competitive market, for without the diffused power and initiative associated with these institutions, it is difficult to imagine a society in which freedom may be effectively preserved. So that's the end of it. And that's like the crux of the neoliberal ideology that and we'll get into this later, I assume, but that they need to redefine the word freedom for their own purposes, because the biggest fetish in America is the fetishization of the word freedom. And as long as they can define freedom, all freedom can be found through the market and through the freedom to exploit others and the freedom of entrepreneurship. That's the only freedom you need. It'll solve everything else.
Side note, that that statement does read like a more sophisticated Fox News broadcast, right? That's line for line what Fox News talks about, right?
Right, exactly.
Also, yeah, the word freedom, I mean, it goes right back to Marx when he talks about how he sarcastically remarks that under capitalism, the worker is liberated from the means of subsistence, right? And is thus free to pursue the those means of subsistence on the market, right? And that's what freedom is, right?
Well, there's two freedoms. So if you're an owner, it's the freedom to be able to
Exploit
and rent people out. And then as a worker, it's the freedom to rent yourself out.
Yeah, that's freedom. It's great, folks. This is called capitalism. Isn't it awesome?
Yeah, and so like the ideological foundation, Harvey talks a lot about that in chapter 1 of this book. He's like, a key part of the ideological foundation of neoliberalism is this tying of like the American ideal of individual freedom and rights to the ultimate encapsulation of that is the freedom to buy, consume, and be a player on the market, right? The free market is the ultimate, is the place where individual freedom is experienced.
We should also note that none of this is new, right? That this same kind of ideology, the same kind of flavor of that, is what was maintained in the 19th century, right? In the time that Marx was writing, by the capitalist class. They were talking about, this is the glory of English. Of the English economy and of English capitalism is that, you have the freedom of interchange on the market, right? And it's beautiful, right?
Yeah, which like it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Like this is not like pre-World War II liberalism and post-Keynesian neoliberalism. It's kind of silly that they have two different words to describe them.
Yeah. So you have the Powell memo, and politically at this time, right, you have this crisis of capital accumulation that we talked about, which was this series of economic shocks. You had the stagflation crisis, the OPEC oil embargo, fiscal crises that sort of ended this post-war political economic consensus we were talking about, embedded liberalism, and this was in the capitalist states. This led to a wave of regulatory reforms that were passed by the Nixon administration in the United States. And more broadly, it was sort of this debate politically between social democrats who sort of wanted more of a role for the state, wanted people to have more of their basic needs met, and corporatists. And Harvey said it was won by the corporatists. So this ideological war that took place as a response to the financial crises was won by the corporatists. And that was the establishment of the neoliberalization. And a big a big sort of foundation. Another foundation for that was the Volcker Shock. So the Volcker Shock occurred in the 70s as well. Paul Volcker was
another Bond villain name, by the way. We have a running tally of this.
That's a good point. Is he on the cover of the book as well? Right?
Not my version. I've got Reagan, Deng, Pinochet, and Thatcher. Who do you guys have?
That's Pinochet. Okay, my bad. Yeah. That's
true. Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought we were like trading neoliberals like Pokemon cards or something.
So Paul Volcker, he's the Fed chairman for Nixon or Reagan.
He's for
79.
Neither of them. Carter. He started with Carter.
Yeah, 79.
But Reagan as well.
Right.
He stays with Reagan as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, and also real quick, yeah, Carter is the proto neoliberal, right?
Right.
That's the argument Harvey makes.
Well, I mean, just sorry to interrupt, but well, actually, let's just get to it later. I do want to talk about a couple of Supreme Court decisions that were made before the Volcker Shock.
Let's do that first. Yeah,
okay.
let's go chronologically.
Okay, sounds good. So in, I believe, 74 and 76, there were two. I don't have it in front of me. It was.
So this is after the Powell memo, right? We have the Powell memo where
Powell
was
probably part of the Supreme Court for at least one of these decisions, but probably both.
Okay, yeah. So the Chamber of Commerce is on notice. The die has been cast to reestablish class power on behalf of the rich and corporations.
Right. So the two Supreme Court decisions were Buckley and Bellotti. It was like
Bellotti,
the state of I don't remember. It was somebody versus Buckley and somebody versus Bellotti.
Yeah, Buckley v. Vallejo.
Yes.
And then Bellotti was the second one.
Yes. And to really like simplify it, those were the Supreme Court decisions that essentially allowed corporations to buy parties. It said like corporate rights are the same as people's rights, and that their ability to give money to politicians cannot be infringed upon because it's free speech, because like people, they also have free speech.
It's the OG Citizens United.
Yes, exactly. And that's why like I kind of roll my eyes when people are like, we got to get rid of Citizens United. It's like we have like 4 other decisions that we have to get rid of that are related to that. But so that occurs in 74 and 76, I believe. So that's like the moment, once again, just reiterating that corporations could literally bribe politicians legally. And first they commandeer the Republicans, and very shortly after they commandeer the Democrats as well.
Yes, and the sort of the establishment of the Republican Party as the political arm of the neoliberals is an important dynamic that we'll talk about as well. Sort of how they built that political coalition, and also put the Democrats in a bind as well. Sort of put them on the back foot. But so you had the two Supreme Court decisions. Harvey also talks about this Volcker Shock. So it's a sort of exercise of monetary policy on behalf of Paul Volcker, who was the Fed chairman for Carter, you said?
Beginning with Carter,
but into Reagan, and I'm not sure how long he lasted after that.
So all the way into Reagan, but in 1979, Paul Volcker decides to confront this crisis of inflation by taking a different approach. In the past, the economic approach was to, the sort of the Keynesian ideal for keeping the economy afloat was to make sure that as many people were employed as possible, right? And to deploy the tools that the state could use to do that, as well as fiscal and monetary policy to do that as well. So with the Volcker Shock, this was a different approach. It was to curb Paul Volcker. He just died in December, by the way. Rest in piss to Paul Volcker. People talk about how no one evil dies anymore. That guy just died. I mean, so let's play our tiny violins a little bit. So the Volcker Shock, which is what it's known as now, was this technique to curb inflation at all costs to employment. So it resulted in huge increase in unemployment, poverty, misery for millions of people worldwide, right? To confront this crisis of inflation, of stagflation, it ushered in a profound recession that gutted labor unions in the 70s, right? So labor power in the capitalist West was severely curtailed in the 70s as a result of the Volcker Shock. And then it led to what was called structural adjustment in countries that were in debt to the rich capitalist nations. So Harvey calls this a necessary precondition for the neoliberal turn as well, was this Volcker Shock. So structural adjustment is going to come up again later in the book when he talks about how neoliberals respond to financial crises. So we'll get into structural adjustment, but it's basically this idea of lending heavily to poor countries through New York investment banks and then demanding that they implement austerity regimes when their economies inevitably collapse. But so the Volcker Shock sort of led to all of these trends: massive unemployment, worldwide poverty, structural adjustment, capitalist domination by the West of these poor nations in the wake of the neoliberal turn. Okay, so that's the Volcker Shock.
And I think a key word to take away would be discipline, right? The Volcker Shocks, you have to discipline labor. That this is how we're going to be running the economy, right?
Yeah.
Right, and also, I'm not exactly sure which years these things occurred, but basically, it became harder and harder to squeeze surplus profit out of American workers. So a lot of those New York investment banks looked towards lending to developing countries. And then the increase in interest rates in the United States, because everyone's tied to the dollar, that massive hike made all of the loans that these developing countries took essentially unpayable. So thus forcing them into a corner of austerity, which I'm kind of rehashing what you said, but I wanted to make it clear that that's kind of like the chain of events.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll give some examples in I believe it's chapter 4 when we talk about like the various cases of this happening. But wrapping up chapter 1 here, basically in chapter 1, Harvey just like lays out his whole case for what neoliberalism is, how it happened, the results, et cetera, et cetera. So he gives some examples of what he calls neoliberal states. He talks about the transitional government in Iraq. Paul Bremer is the guy who orchestrated that, which was a flagrantly neoliberal apparatus. And he talks about Chile a little bit in this chapter too, but we'll get to that. One of the main things he talks about towards the end is how to interpret neoliberalism, which is sort of still up for debate. What he says is neoliberalization can either be interpreted as a utopian project that's like if you believe neoliberalism's at face value, right? So the philosophy at face value as a utopian project to realize a theoretical design for the reorganization of international capitalism, right? That traces back to the ideas of the Mont Pelerin Society and the basically foundational ideology of neoliberalism. So do we interpret it as this set of ideas that's like sort of this utopian project for building this new regime, or do we interpret it as a political project to reestablish the conditions for capital accumulation and to restore the power of economic elites? And this is going to be an argument that he makes over and over again, that it's actually the latter. The results, regardless of the intentions of neoliberals, the results have sort of contradicted what it should have been in theory. And sort of it's always played out more as this reconstitution of class power. And this is a theme that we see repeated over and over again throughout the book.
Right. It's sold just to overly simplify it. It's sold as a way to improve or develop your economy and society. But what it really is just a way for elites to find a more dominant position within that society. It's a bait and switch. The bait is, look how much growth this will create. Look what this will do for your country, this, that, and the other. And then the switch is actually, it was just to enhance elite power. It wasn't to enhance universal quality of life.
Right. And that kind of political project you can trace back. A classic example is the French Revolution, where when the ruling class decides on a project, or if that sounds too reifying, if a class project emerges as the dominant one, there will always be sycophantic economists who will emerge to justify and provide the rationale for that project, whatever it is, right?
To manufacture consent.
Yeah, which perfectly leads us into chapter 2, where he talks about how the elites really convinced people to be on board with this project. Even though maybe they weren't even really calling it neoliberalism at the time. They were just like, come on, this is freedom. It's synonymous with freedom. It's like the freedom of the market.
They don't even do that now. Nobody is like, I'm a neoliberal Democrat, you know, like proudly wears the badge.
That's a good point.
In fact, even fucking Pete Buttigieg was like, I remember he had talked about neoliberalism briefly in one of the debates, and it's like, dude, you are a neoliberal. Like,
unless you go to the subreddit r neoliberal, which, I mean, if you want to go to the true internet hellscape, go to that or r landlord. Those two are beautiful.
Jesus Christ.